just hold for silence for a couple seconds. Welcome everybody to the second session of week 4 of Devtoberfest, our security week. And we're very happy to have a distinguished roundtable of guests with us this morning. With little further ado, I'll go ahead and turn over to Helen, who is going to be our moderator for today's session. Let her go ahead and really run the rest of the session. So Helen, floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas, and welcome everybody to our roundtable for software supply chain. I think we have a very interesting discussion today and very interesting guest as well. So my name is Helen Oakley, and I'm Senior Product Security Architect at SAP. And today we want to have a discussion about security aspect of supply chain, software supply chain. But first of all, let's go through a quick roundtable. And I'd like to start with Michelle. Michelle, could you please briefly introduce yourself? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm Michelle Treberka. I'm Chief Security Architect of SuccessFactors. I have a background in academia, finance, media, and have just recently joined SuccessFactors.
Thank you, Michelle. And we'll move forward to Thorsten. Thorsten?
My name is Thorsten Dange. I'm Development Architect Security at SAP, and in my current role, I'm owner of the product security standard and the Secure SDL, defining the security standards or qualities of SAP software.
Perfect. Let's move on to Sacher.
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Sascha Paulus. I'm professor for IT security at Mannheim University of Applied Sciences. And one of my favorite topics is secure software development. Among other things, I've been writing one of the first security product standards for SAP when I was there 20 years ago.
That's awesome. And last but not least, Ralph.
I have no history with SAP except using it. My name is Ralph Wiegand. I'm from the Microsoft Germany as the National IT Compliance Officer, which includes also the cybersecurity and data privacy aspects.
Thank you. Thank you for those in this introduction. Now, let's move on. I know my slide been jumping back and forth. But the first question I have for this panel today is, what is supply chain from your perspective and what role security plays in it? So let's start with Michelle.
Oh, thank you. So the supply chain is pretty much exactly what you're looking at. It's like the making of a product. So in traditional supply chain, it would be making a car or an iPhone. And what we're talking about is we're taking the application of the concept of making a physical item, and we're looking at the software supply chain in every stage of how you create that. I think it's one of the most important issues in technology. Assurance of the integrity of that supply chain isn't new, but it's become recently a very hot topic, especially in the US.
Thank you, Michelle, for that. And let's see what other panelists also have in mind. Let's move on. Who I have here on the Zoom. So Sasha.
Yeah, I think it's already been explained. So the manufacturing, production, and servicing of software is highly complicated, as there are many stakeholders involved. So that we have indeed, in many cases, a very complex supply chain involving different stakeholders from different regions of the world with different financial models behind. So we're talking about open source software later on, probably more in depth. And there are two major requirements. One is that, from a security perspective, one is that the security of the software that is upstream developed is maintained, is assured, and second, that the chain itself, of course, is not manipulated.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned open source. I'm pretty sure we can have more discussion on that. But hold that thought. Let's see what Thorsten has in mind.
Yeah, just have in mind that the rise of open source currently put really some pressure on this, and also some let's say modern deploy systems like containers also, which makes the topic really very prominent, even if it's not a really new one. Because I think it's since a couple of years that attackers know that the victims are that the peripheral systems of suppliers are a much better target than the customers themselves.
Thank you. And Ralph?
Yeah, I want to add to the security role that software supply chain is. If you remember back, the Trojan horse, they were guarding the doors, but they took in the horse, and inside that horse, there was the enemy. So it's the same here. You have this software that you're using from somewhere, and you don't know what's in there unless you really, really check it carefully. So that's the problem with the supply chain. It offers an attack vector for externals to sneak into your software line, and that's what software supply chain makes it so critical.
Thank you for those explanations and opinions. By the way, our session is a little bit unusual in terms of that I'm still working on a slide. So while we're having a discussion, I have this key takeaway slide for our audience, and I'm just putting a note from what answers we hear, and we will present that at the end as a summary. But in the meantime, I would like to move on to my next question and discuss further. What are the supply chain attacks or threats do you see? And we know about SolarWinds and many other. So why don't we start with Thorsten this time and see if you can bring spotlight some of the risks that we have in security here?
Yeah, like I said before, open source software brings, or the heavy usage of open source software, in this case brings a lot of new threats in, especially, for instance, the use of these package managers, like you have in Python or NPM or so, where it's very easy to download libraries and software and use it in your code. Makes it very easy to inject malicious code into it.
Thank you. I think it's a very good point, right, about the open source. And let's move on right now to Ralph.
For sure, the complexity comes here when you look at the dependencies for source code, because that code that you import can also have other dependencies, which will also have dependencies, and well, you have to check it all up the chain to be really sure that you don't have any malicious code in there that sneaks into. So that makes it really complex task here.
Like someone says, devil is in details. We say devil in dependencies, right?
Yep, something like that.
Awesome. Michelle, why don't we take it over to you?
Okay. I think we're all sort of finding a theme here, which is open source software. Why? Because it's, from an attacker perspective, you get a really big bang for your buck, right? If you compromise an open source software project, you have the potential to blanket, to cover multiple industries, to get a foothold in across a broad cross section of commercial enterprises and government, et cetera. And why is that so easy? Because developer velocity. Right now, developers work at a much faster pace. So, and they're very dependent on open source for that velocity. So they're not as likely to be as circumspect. They're not going to necessarily always take the same kinds of precautions because they need to deliver. And I think, in my opinion, I would agree that that's the biggest threat. I mean, for example, if people have been following the news, there was the controversy over the Linux kernel where some hypocrite commits were made as part of a research project to see how easy it would be to compromise a large open source software project, which they did. There was a lot of argument about whether or not it was an ethical project, but it did demonstrate that it was not terribly difficult, and it took days and weeks of discussion to actually get it resolved. So I think that that's probably one of the biggest threats, because you're basically taking material from the outside, and with varying levels of sanitization and quarantining, you're bringing it into your internal organization, it's a natural place of major threat, in my opinion.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned also on an aspect that development is usually rushing. We have limited timeline, right? We maybe don't have enough time to address all the issues or even think about some issues. And that's a great example that we saw with SolarWinds and perhaps many other, right? When those threats were undetected for as long as 15 months, while our development is rushed to speed to market with speed and agility over putting the high priority over security aspect of the software, right? Now let's hear what Sasha has in mind about threats in supply chain.
Actually, I'd like to add one more perspective. I don't think that per se open source is more dangerous than closed source. Actually, it depends on the quality of the assurance program that you have behind that. And of course, you may have good open source projects that control the software development quite well, whereas you have closed source projects in smaller companies mostly that are not very expert in that activity. So as an example, since there are no such thing like 100% secure software, there's always a choice you need to make against what you want to protect your software. So the security profile of your software is something specific to your use case that you have in mind. So, and if you use software downstream along the supply chain for a completely different purpose, you're going to probably miss the security profile of what the software actually was built against. So this is also something to take into account when you look at this, and this is often happening also in-house in large organizations where the security profile of different modules are not checked against their own security requirements.
Thank you for that. And I'm, as like I said, I'm adding notes. It's a very interesting discussion. But let's move on. Let's move on to a next level discussion. So here I would like to talk about, responsibilities and addressing security risks. Like, what can we do? Maybe let's start with responsibilities. So what roles are involved in managing software supply chain? And this time, let's start with Sasha.
Okay, I think my colleagues will focus on different roles, so I will only mention two. One is, of course, the developers, and developers themselves, as I've been one in the past, are pretty lazy. So this is probably the main reason why they became developers, because you can actually build great things being lazy. But that also means that they need to rely and to be able to use an infrastructure that makes them the usage of software as secure as possible. So my focus would be on providing and making sure there is a development infrastructure team that makes sure that all these different security checks, assurance, quality controls are actually built into the infrastructure, so that developers cannot make any major mistake without leaving the tool chain.
Thank you for that. Let's move on to Torsten.
Yeah, I want to answer something Michelle said, because she said that developers are on very rush to develop new software. And for me, this is a responsible of the program management, because open source software is not is as expensive as commercial software, because you have to take care of some stuff, yeah, which usually the vendor does. Yeah, and you have to take care of searching for the right open source software, for updating it and stuff like this. And I think program managers or POs have to give the developers the time to do this. Yeah, and not only thinking, hey, you can download software and easily use it, and to speed up development. Yeah, it's as expensive as commercial software. Yeah, it's just you have to give the internal resources for the developers to take care of this additional work they have to do on open source software.
That's a good point. Make sure that we allocate enough resources, right, to take care of that. You mentioned Michelle. Let's move on to Michelle this time.
So I have a belief in the shared responsibility model in modern development environments. To me, security is a quality issue. So I don't call an electrician when I need to plug in a lamp, right? A lamp has a certain prescribed governance in the methodology that I use to plug it in. I only call an electrician when I plug in the lamp and I'm not getting a connection, right? And I feel that that's really, when we talk about the responsibilities for addressing the security and risk of a software supply chain, I would assert that it's everyone's responsibility. Sure, you have product owners, product managers, you have an SDLC governance team, which might focus on DevOps governance and maturity and how security fits into that. But ultimately, the supply chain, it's an expression of well-documented business rules that include governance, not just security, right? And when you do that well, when you're governed well, when you have really well-documented business rules that are expressed through your automation, you have quality software, not just secure software.
Thank you. I like that. And I totally agree. Security is a quality issue. Yeah. Let's see what Ralph has in mind in terms of roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, I would like to go a little bit up the chain and see there the source. Again, I'm with the dependencies. Where's the source coming? Is that the maintainer of that source that you're including? Has that changed? Is it someone less trustworthy? Was there a fork in the project and some other teams continue to develop that source that you depend on? So this is a constant monitoring of your sources where you integrate, where you copy and paste, where you depend on. This is not only watching the source code; it's also a risk assessment. Is that team where I copy where I depend from, is that still trustworthy enough to include that code?
Thank you. So that's interesting, and we already moving into partially. Here's a responsibility and you have to watch for something. So Ralph, maybe we can continue with you and expand a little bit. So what developers can do, how can they handle the most immediate risks in terms of development and operation process of the software supply chain?
Well, I guess the other attendees will go into the details a little bit more. So what I want to bring up is why don't you write the source code for yourself? So if this is only a small task, why do you add some dependency on other source instead of writing it for yourself? You have all the tools, you have all the knowledge. Why always copying or including dependencies? The less dependencies, the more security you can gain here. That would be my idea, but open for discussion with the other colleagues here on the call.
That's interesting. Michelle, what do you think?
I've been around a long time, and I have mixed feelings. I mean, there's a certain beauty in modularity and reusability aspect that it makes sense, but I think what has disappointed me with the open source community, not with the community itself, but the way there's a lot of take and very little give. So I'll see a lot of commercial entities, depend on open source, but then not help contribute back. I think if you're going to use open source and rely on it, then you have a responsibility. You think you're getting by inexpensively. It's like, oh, I can just use open source and save some money. I think that's the wrong approach. I think you should approach open source as, hey, here's an opportunity to share and standardize on some ways of doing things that are more efficient and effective, but that doesn't let you off the hook for giving back to the community. So if you're not willing to do that or not able to do that, then I think I would agree that maybe you shouldn't be using open source in the first place. Are you seeing where I'm coming from with that? Maybe it's my academic background where it was a very give and take sort of situation.
May I add something here for Michelle? But if you give back, the responsibility is much higher, because if there's a piece of code coming from SAP, it's surely more trustworthy seen as coming from this small group of programmers somewhere. I don't know where they come from. So that adds some more responsibility, some more pressure to the developers here. And I guess that's why some teams don't do that.
And I think that's a totally valid point as well, right? If you contributing as individual, you have less pressure than contributing from a company like Microsoft or SAP, right? Yeah.
Sure, but think about the OpenSSL vulnerability of a few years ago, and why was that? Why did that happen? Because people were overloaded, and because we didn't have enough eyes, looking at what was being contributed to the code. That's my only concern, right?
And I see Sasha wanted to add something here.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that meant the person actually providing the open source enhancement could actually well work daily on a day basis for SAP or Microsoft, but they contribute in their free time to projects, right? It could still be the same person, right? It really depends on the process, how it's integrated into the quality assurance. And to your question, I think. Actually, if developers are using software from somewhere else where they have actually access to source code and they discover a security issue, security vulnerability, and they're able to fix it, then they should do so. I mean, this is also something of contributing. Even if they can't fix it in the source code in a closed source environment, at least they could inform the company upstream to actually with the corresponding ideas on how to fix the issue, right? Or in open source, they could actually contribute a patch.
Mm-hmm. And Torsten, been quiet. Torsten, I'm pretty sure you have an opinion on this.
Yes, I want to come back to the initial opinion from Ralph on writing the stuff on your own. So yeah, I think this can be done, yeah, for small pieces of code, but usually this is what you are using, yeah, and I can say this as a part-time developer, yeah. So there are really good examples of libraries out there, yeah, and you don't want to write them on your own, yeah, because it's not your core business, yeah. You just want to write some say business software, yeah, and then you need a parser or stuff like this, and it's really, yeah, like to say sexy, yeah, to download this, yeah, and then to use it, yeah. So I think it's not a really it doesn't work to write everything on your own, yeah, because this is the nice thing on open source, yeah. But I think, and this is sorry. Yeah, sorry.
So that wasn't my intention. It's like Michelle said, when I'm putting in a bulb, I don't call an electrician. But if it's a larger project, sure, it's better to rely on tested libraries. So just to make that clear.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really it's a nice thing, yeah, if you can just do an npm whatever, yeah, and on Python, yeah, to download a library which does the stuff for you, yeah. But and this is to my topic of the responsibility, yeah. You have to do some governance work, yeah. You have to look for the license, and you have to check it for vulnerabilities, or take a look on the SNCC advisor also, yeah, to take care. This is a well-maintained library, yeah. And it's some kind of trustworthy also, yeah. Don't download something which has no updates since the last 2 or 3 years, or so, yeah. So, and this is something a developer really can do, yeah.
And that's a very good point, Torsten. The checking library and doing some checks and being really on top of open source, what you have in your software, yeah. If you're using that, you have to be on top of it. So let's move on to and talk a little bit about what developers can do to check or verify the security of the supply chain. So what would you tell them? What should they do? Maybe Torsten, let's start with you this time.
Yeah, like I said before, yeah, they can just have a look. How well maintained is it? Yeah, when were the last updates? How much contributors are there? Is it only one guy who works only twice a year on it, or is there a large community out of it? Yeah, then there are tools. Yeah, I don't want to advertise something, but I know that there is a SNCC advisor. I use this tool also, yeah, where you can take a look how trustworthy libraries are. Yeah, and you can just use some scanners to scan them for vulnerabilities also. Yeah.
But I want to pick on something that you said, Thorsten, and maybe other panelists can also expand on this topic. You mentioned don't download library. 2 years, more than 2 years. Are we sure that only the latest library is always secure?
No, this is a different story. Yeah, this is another one. Yeah, when you have someone, I think you have, especially in your dependency tree or so, yeah, you have always to stick on a particular version. But, yeah, probably somebody has a different opinion than me.
Sasha, you are on
Sasha,
mute.
you are mute.
Thank you so much. In general, I would say that newer versions are typically more secure than older versions, right? So probably not if you're starting a new branch with new types of features, then probably not. But if you look down in a series of stable versions that are ongoing fixes, then I probably would choose always the latest one.
Yeah, but it's yeah. It's a weakness, or it makes a vulnerability, yeah, because there is some sort of attacks, yeah, which especially uses this, yeah, when you say you always use the latest, because when an attacker can inject a malicious library, yeah, and you always download the latest, yeah, and they put a library with a version which has a really high number, yeah, you download this malicious one, yeah. So
yeah, but this is I understand. Yeah. That's of course, but this is kind of tricking me in the process. This is not looking at the right library. I mean, this is a different type of attack, I think.
Maybe it's something. There was this old saying: never install a .0 version. So if there are major breaks, and that's why we got rid of those. We only use integers now for Windows versions. No, can we cut out this? I guess what Thorsten is trying to say, if there's a major release, don't immediately jump on it, because there are so many breaks in this library sometimes that you have to recheck. But I agree with you, Sasha. If there's a 0.2 instead of a 0.1, use that.
And Michelle.
I just want to point out that we're very focused on open source software here, and while I do think, again, as I said, there's a lot of bang for the buck if you're an attacker with dependencies. It's not the only place, right? And so I think I have a love-hate relationship with threat modeling. I think people get very hung up on what it can deliver, and it can get very difficult to get continuous updating of a threat model. However, I think threat modeling your supply chain adds a lot of value here, because it's not just open source. I mean, you've got the build phase, you've got all kinds of places that can be compromised, or that can have a lack of assurance. That's where something like SLSA is really good. It's SLSA, but it's pronounced SLSA. It's a new way of looking at and protecting the supply chain at each stage of development. It's a maturity model. I think, from my perspective, I always look to add validation at every state change. So if something is going to be introduced, time to validate. If something is going to be changed, time to validate. And sometimes I'll get the feedback that's, well, why don't we trust anything? No, don't trust anything. That's the whole point of zero trust, right? You want to look for opportunities to do a fast path. That's a firewall term from the olden days, where you would initially do a heavy slow path validation, and then you would validate the validation in the sequence. So further down the pipeline, you check to see, hey, is this the same, or has it been changed? Has there been a state change? I'm going to revalidate it, or I'm just going to say, if nothing has changed, then I'm going to let it pass, but I have checked that it was validated previously. Is that, and we need to look at it holistically as one big picture. And I think it's easy to sort of, not that it's not important, but sometimes it's easy to get lost in just the open source software portion.
And thank you for that. I really like the idea of threat model, right? Your process. I think it's very important, and something that we often overlook. How we verify, how we validate our process and all the policies along the way. Anyone else on the panel have anything else to add to this point? Sasha? No?
I think all has been said to that question.
Okay. Right. So I have a follow-up question. We talked about development. We talked about the process and ways to verify. Let's touch a little bit on the management. I'm pretty sure we have some management in the audience as well. So how can management help, or from their perspective, how can they limit or prevent those security threats around software supply chain? Let's start with Sasha.
My first pledge would be that management should give developers a safe programming environment in the first place, so that the IDE, the tool chain, the integration of additional security checking tools is managed from an infrastructure team where developers need not need to mess with this individually, right? So this is something that should work right away and should serve its purpose, so that developers can really concentrate on their expertise, for example, in integrating specific models in a secure way. I think this is something. This is costly. It takes time to build this up. You need some experience in the market. It's probably dependent also on in which sector you're working. So this is not as easy as it sounds, right? It's not just buying GitHub or a GitLab commercial license for the company and there you go. It's really something you need to get built over time to have the expertise in-house as well.
Interesting. Yes, I totally agree. We have to look at the tools. Ralph, what would you add here?
I don't want to go into the tools. I guess that's Torsten's area more. I want to say what the management can do is to raise the awareness of the responsibility of the developer, because in the same way that you depend on quality software up the chain, others depend on your software down the chain. So if you're aware as a developer of that responsibility, and that's what your management can give you, raise this awareness a little bit, this really helps that, and of course, time to check stuff. So it's not only the tools or the environment. As a developer, you need time to do tests, to do security checks, to make a risk assessment of how can I import that code, or is it better to write it by myself? Or there has to be enough time. Most security issues come from a lack of time. This has to be done quickly. And there is Christmas coming, and the product needs to go out before Christmas. That's the highest risk I ever saw in my history, is time pressure.
Yeah, that's indeed, speed to market, right? Michelle, yep. What do you think about that?
So I think from a management perspective, I mean, I built programs before, product security programs before, and the outline of that, I think, I always use this analogy of little kids playing soccer or football. We call it soccer in the US, right? Where when you watch little kids play soccer, they tend to swarm left and swarm right following the ball. And there's very little strategy involved. It's all tactical. And I think the danger is that when management gets caught up in the tactical part of it instead of the focusing on the overall strategy. And what does that mean? That means focusing on documenting the SDLC and scoring the maturity of it. Because what I see frequently, I go into places and I'll ask to see the SDLC, I'll ask to see the DevOps, subway maps, pipelines, and everything else, and nobody has this documentation well articulated or in a single place, and it spends me literally months trying to figure out how they just build software. And if it's that hard for me to figure out, that's a problem. These are business rules, right? And then I think it's important to use some of the frameworks that are out there, like CMMI, BSIM, SAM, to identify where you are in terms of maturity and where you have growth areas. It's so easy to get caught up in, oh, we just need this new extra special tool that's going to magically solve all our problems. I don't think they do, right? And then I mentioned threat modeling and looking for discrete risks that you've missed in the by documenting your supply chain. and adding in, thinking in terms of attestation at every point where you can add attestation, right? And because remember, if you've done your job right, your software pipeline should also integrate, your supply chain should integrate concepts of separation of duty and least privilege, right? Because that way you're also following proper security concepts. I think it's a little easy to get too focused on the tactical, and management's job is to pull up a little bit and try to focus on higher strategy issues.
Thank you. And like I said, I'm keeping up the notes. Thorsten, you've been referenced as a tool guy, as a maybe development. What do you think about that?
Yeah, yeah, I'm think this is something, yeah, like Sasha said, which must be well prepared, yeah, and is some kind of management responsibility. But nevertheless, I think the security in the end is something people have to do, and therefore, for me, the let's say the management responsibility is to educate, to make sure that the developers are well educated in writing the secure software, yeah, and that they have the right tools in the right place, yeah. But I think education, I know in Germany, yeah, software security is not in every education takes place. So not every new developer has knowledge in IT security or in developing secure software. Yeah. So and this is, for me, is a responsibility of the management to ensure this, yeah, that they have on-the-job trainings to ensure that they are able to write secure software, that they know what they are doing. Yeah.
Well, there's two things I'd like to add here. I mean, what in security, if you talk about security awareness, you need always to think of a two-step approach. The first step is you need to make the people sensible for the issue, so that they feel responsible, and only in the second step you can actually then educate them to solve the problem. So what I see in my experience in consulting companies and educating students is the problem is not the second step. The problem is the first step, to get the developers feeling responsible for the security of the code that they're manufacturing, not only writing, but manufacturing, integrating other code, making sure it works in different environments, yep, and making sure it works securely in different environments. This is the crucial thing from my point of view regarding security awareness and development.
So
but
I'd like
to be honest,
sorry.
Go ahead.
I'd like to take a slightly different perspective, though. The thing that I most often see, I don't think a developer ever wakes up and says, I'm going to write the worst software I can possibly write. Nobody does that unless they're a psychopath, right? And you don't see that many in software development. I think on the other side of that is that security people also need to step up and do a better job of understanding how developers work. That's one of the major problems that I see, that they don't really grasp what a developer lifecycle looks like, the time pressures they're under, and the velocity and the tooling that they use. Sometimes I see that it's a little tone deaf on the security side itself. So I think we need to do a better job of meeting development where they are and helping them, while understanding that it's not all about us, that it's, you're ultimately there to deliver a software product.
And I totally agree to Michelle. Yeah, I just want to add also that I never saw a developer which thought, hey, I want to write worse software. Yeah, so we said, or we discussed that security is also a quality topic. Yeah, and developers have their aim is to write software with good quality. Yeah, therefore I don't see this awareness point, or I don't see really this awareness point. I think it's really that they have the knowledge on how to do it.
Okay.
Sasha, you're not agreeing?
No, I'm not agreeing.
Fill it out.
I have a different experience.
And it's about sharing experiences here, right? So
yeah.
I'm also not fully agree to Michelle on that point, unfortunately, because I still think that only if you're aware of your responsibility to the code you're writing or the code you're releasing. It helps to ensure the quality. Of course, you're right, they should know what they do, and they should not be only part-time developers doing that in their spare time. If you want to write real good quality software and secure software, this is a full-day job. That's not something you do in the evening and write some source code lines here.
And it's also important to keep in mind, I mean, of course, developers don't want to write bad software, but if they're under time pressure, as you mentioned, Ralph, then they need to make decisions about priorities. And security is in most cases not the top priority, because functionality always beats security.
Well,
As long as we write software in a market where customers pay for the functionality. If you're in a different market where security is more important, that changes.
So
right?
what bothers me about that statement is I'm going to hear the word that I cannot stand, which is NFR. And security is not an NFR. And I think that's the conversation that needs to happen as well. Security is a feature of modern software, because there is no customer of our software out there who's going to say, yeah, I don't really care if it's secure. You know, I don't care if my personal information is, downloaded. It's not that important to me. I care about the other things. No, they care. It's just as much of a feature. And I assert that we need to, if we treat it that way in our software development lifecycle, if we say that security is an important feature, then developers will treat it that way too.
Point taken.
But this brings the responsibility to the POs, to give the developers the time, because where I agree to Sasha is that the market wants to have functionality, and POs often wants to have functionality because they these are their goals. Yeah.
It's a priority issue. I mean, ultimately, if we give developers enough time and resources, they will write perfect code, but they will never have all the time of the world, right?
Well, we should remember the other aspects of DevOps, right? It's people, process, culture, and technology, right? And I think what happens is that the people, process, and culture elements are often subsumed underneath, by the technology aspect. And, when we forget about, emphasizing security in the culture, when we forget about documenting our processes and focusing on that, when we neglect, training the people, or, socializing awareness or collaborating with them in a more shared model, then I think that's when you start to have problems.
Mm.
And I like this comment about security culture. I believe that everything starts with people. The change starts with people. And if we want to make that change, we have to focus on people beyond the technology and everything. It's like when we were moving from waterfall to agile, right, to DevOps. If you remember that pain, it's the same here. Okay, I really love the discussion. For the time being, let's move on to the slide that I have been putting together here with the notes for our audience. I really try to keep to 3 to 5 points, but I end up with 7. I hope it summarizes our discussion. And while I leave this on the screen here, I wanted to go through a round table of panelists, and to our audience, I know that we are streaming live. If you have any questions, we do have time for Q&A, so please send your questions away and we can answer them live. Otherwise, let's wrap up this conversation by providing one advice or one key point that you want our audience to take away from our today's session as a summary, or something that you think developers and development in general should think about. So let's start with Michelle.
I like that. So I say this a lot: security is a quality issue and security is a feature. If you're addressing security as an NFR, a non-functional requirement, game over. I think you've already lost. That's, I think, the most important thing for me. That's the way that you really achieve collaboration with your software development teams.
Thank you for that. So who wants to take away next? Should I call you out or need a second to think? Ralph, you're laughing a lot.
Since Michelle already broke the ice, let me continue. Maybe on a little unconventional view, it's the advice that I would have to the developers is understand the code, not only the code that you write, but the code that you implement. So maybe sometimes just take a view from the other side. Just switch to the dark side and think about how would I compromise that code that I have here, that I'm using here, and how would I do that? And then you might find a better way to make that more secure. And I'm sure Sasha and Thorsten have other advices.
Okay, Sasha?
Yeah, my take is especially in DevOps, I think to achieve secure software, one needs to invest into a well-governed development infrastructure where security activities are as far as possible integrated automatically, so that developers cannot escape the security activities, right? So just put the pressure from them so that they need to think about this themselves, rather integrate this into the infrastructure so it pops up if they have something to do around security, because I don't know, any check didn't run through and they need to relook at a specific code and check what happens there.
And Holsten?
Yeah, I just want to follow up on something Ralph said, to developers to look on their code. And I think threat modeling in this case really helps. Yeah. And I performed some threat modeling workshops in the past, and it was very funny for the developers, yeah, to put on the dark hats or black hats, yeah, and try to break their own stuff, yeah. And they have a lot of fun, and I think it worked really well, yeah, as some kind of creative workshop. But this is not my recommendation. What I want to add as a recommendation is just to the security responsibles, yeah, and this goes in the direction Michelle said, yeah, to the security responsibles should take care or go down to the developers, so to say, yeah, and just speak with them, get to them where they are, yeah, and the developers should see the security responsibles not as their enemies, yeah. They are there to help you, or they should be there to help you, yeah. They are not enemies, yeah, and the security responsibles on their own, yeah, should also see the developers not as enemies, yeah. They are there to help them to write secure software.
Thank you for that. And while I was checking the chat here, we have several questions, so let's address them. I'll read the question, first one. Interesting direction, though I wouldn't be the first question based on what criteria could assess the security profile of a community in the first place. I think this question was raised when we were talking about open source and contribution into community. Who would like to take it away? So based on the criteria, could assess the security profile of a community in the first place.
Oh, you're talking about an open source project.
Yes,
like
yes.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think what I tend to do is I'll look at, okay, what are the most recent, is it an active project? Is it 2 years old and there haven't been any updates in 2 years? There haven't been any PRs, no commits, no issues. Do they respond to the issues? I think that's one of the things I'll look at. I'll investigate, okay, how many different types of open source libraries do the same thing? Are they more popular than this one? Maybe I'll look at the developers, the contributors. What else do they contribute to? Is that software that we've used before that we've had problems with? Then I might search. I'll go to the NVD, the National Vulnerability Database, and I'll see what kind of vulnerabilities exist that haven't been addressed or that have been over time. Maybe I'll go back, 4 or 5 years. I'll just do a Google search and I'll see, okay, have there been any responsible disclosures? Has it come up as a vulnerability that has caused a vulnerability in a commercial product, right? That's typically what I do when I'm evaluating something. It's a little more, it's kind of manual, and there are probably tools that can do that much less manually now. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on that sort of process.
Good.
Quiet.
Yeah. We do have
Nothing to
a,
add. Yeah. Well done.
I used to do a lot of threat intel, so that's probably why my approach is very detailed.
yeah, there are several instances online where we can try to look for any potential threats, so exploits in a software, right? But it's the challenge is that it's manual mostly. You have to kind of look at that. But we have a follow-up question. So from another audience member, keep in mind the software vendor gets blamed for vulnerabilities, but not open source community. So how would you, what do you think about that? It's more a comment, not a question, but it's an interesting point. I think that's usually true.
Well, the issue is that with open source, you don't have an identity which takes care about the responsibility for specific software piece, right? The open source community is a great whole. You don't know who is actually developing what. I mean, if you follow more closely, you probably can do for sure, but in general, you don't. And so nobody actually takes responsibility for that. And this ends in the perception that there's nobody actually taking care about security, so nobody is blamed, right? It's just like it is, right? It's there, and use it or leave it, right?
An interesting comment from the chat. Yeah, go ahead, Rolf.
Yeah, but because I'm not agree to this point. And from the chat, I think the open source community is still blamed for vulnerabilities because it reduces the trust that you set in open source software. The more vulnerabilities that pop up, the less trust you have in open source. And it doesn't matter if it's the programmer X or developer Z, it's open source software that loses here. So, okay.
So the responsibility wise, we talked about responsibility, and the comment from the chat we have, so take responsibility for the world we live in. For example, in a large company has proprietary security scanning software, make it easy available to open source community. What do you think? Should we go towards that direction and be involved in community that way?
I think that's what the direction that's already being taken, especially in the container community. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. A lot of commercial companies donate tools that can be used as open source to help, because they want to make it serves everyone to make open source and to make containerization and that to make security more available and more baked into everything we do. So I think vendors are coming around, and I appreciate that that everyone's trying to unify and collaborate to reduce the attack surface.
And maybe we can close, we are almost at the top of the hour. Maybe we can close with the last question here. Can you suggest where to find knowledge about code security in SAP? And still, since we have also Microsoft here, maybe we can have input from Microsoft too. Who wants to take that away?
Yeah, I think
Torsten?
from a SAP point of view, yeah, I think help.sap.com is the place to look at. And for more common or compliance statements also, there is the SAP Trust Center. Yeah, you can look at.
I could also add maybe SAP community blogs, because there's a lot of blogs by SAP experts as well who write about different security topics, right?
And of course, it's developer.microsoft.com where you find all the gorgeous lessons, workshops, and so on for programmers and developers here. Developer.microsoft.com.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for this interesting discussion. I'm really glad I was able to discuss software security supply chain. It's a very prominent topic these days. And thank you for the audience who listened to us. Now, Thomas, I'll give it to you to take it away and close up the session.
Yes, thank you, Helen. And thank you to all of our experts who joined the panel today. I hope everyone enjoyed the discussion and learned a lot from it. Security Week continues for the remainder of the week. Tomorrow we have a live stream session focused on the coding challenge for the week. We have a coding challenge available for ABAP developers and for Cloud Application Programming Model Node.js developers, where we have a project with some security vulnerabilities that you can go through an exercise to fix those security vulnerabilities. And we'll walk through some of the setup and getting you started with that in tomorrow's session. And then on Thursday, Michelle, one of our panelists that you saw here today, will continue to do the discussion on container security. It's all about the supply chain. So if you want to learn more on this topic and you enjoyed her presence on the panel today, then I encourage you to join us again on Thursday, where she will lead that discussion. And of course, keep in mind that Friday, we're going to have some fun. Our Fun Friday activity this week is our gaming night. So join the Discord server, find some friends from the SAP community that you want to game with, and take some time out of your Friday end of the day, whenever you finish up your work. Our team will be online throughout the day to game with people in various time zones. But we just encourage you to get together with your fellow SAP community members and do a little fun online gaming. But until then, join us again tomorrow for more of Security Week, and we'll see you then.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
All right.